In 1859, the U.S. and British Canada nearly went to war over a pig. The pig in question, a Berkshire boar living on San Juan Island, had been shot and killed by an American farmer outraged to find the animal rooting around his potato patch. The dispute over the slain pig quickly devolved into something much more serious, because both Britain, via the Hudson Bay Company, and the U.S., via Washington Territory, had laid claim to San Juan Island, an isolated outpost located in the Strait of Juan de Fuca, along the westernmost edge of the newly established U.S.-Canada border. This dispute, dubbed the Pig War, involved presidents, generals, warships, and soldiers. And though it had just one casualty, the pig, it stands as one of many conflicts that have emerged between Canada and the U.S. over their shared border. Many of these disputes emerged from the territory-grabbing confusion that followed the end of the Revolutionary War. North America had long been sliced into sections by the world's colonial powers, with substantial portions belonging to both Great Britain and Spain. But following the American Revolution, a great territorial convulsion occurred across the continent. Claims by Spain and Britain, and France and Russia, shrank and swelled as the decades passed. Meanwhile, ambiguous territorial boundaries that had been established after the Revolutionary War between the United States and British Canada were challenged as the former began to grow. In the Northeast, this led to the Aroostook War in 1838, and in the Northwest, it led to disputes over territory in Oregon in the 1840s, as well as the Pig War in the 1850s. Further territorial developments, like the purchase of Alaska by the United States in 1867, also led to confusion and debate over where exactly the Canadian-U.S. border was located. In this case, the debate over its location was further spurred by the Klondike Gold Rush, which sent tens of thousands of prospectors north in search of riches. Far from being an issue specific to our present moment, territorial disputes between Canada and the U.S. stretch back almost 200 years. In fact, conflicts over the border between Canada and the United States have existed since the borders were first drawn. Today, we'll discuss some of the areas of the border that have been disputed over the past 2 centuries, including some that are still disputed to this day. You're listening to History Uncovered, brought to you by the digital publisher All That's Interesting, where we explore the uncharted corners of the natural world and the world past. I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Kalina Fraga.
And I'm All That's Interesting staff writer Austin Harvey.
Today, we're discussing the tumultuous history of border disputes between the United States and Canada. I'm from Washington State, so I grew up most of my life near the Canadian border. Well, like 3 hours south.
Yeah, well, that's pretty near, comparatively.
Yeah, pretty near. There's this one part of Washington that's like, I don't know how this happened. I guess I could have researched this for this episode, but it's like a peninsula. But to get to mainland Washington, you need to drive through Canada, north through Canada, and then back down. And during COVID, this caused problems because the borders were shut.
Right, yeah.
But they were Americans and they needed to...
Got to get there, yeah.
So I think they may have made an exception for that area. But in any case, we're going to dig into some of these disputes that have happened between Canada and the United States. There have been quite a few, and actually some of them continue to this day.
Right.
And I'm not just speaking about like our current political situation. Like there are still disputed areas of the border like that are just not unresolved.
Sense. That makes sense, yeah.
But yeah, just to like kind of set this up. I mean, I think most people know this, but before the Revolutionary War, the U.S. and Canada were both British territories. There really was no need for, or maybe not as much need for dispute there. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, this is after the Revolutionary War, the British acknowledged U.S. independence and they ceded Northwest Territory to the U.S., which contained states like Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, in that area. And they agreed to a northern boundary along the 45th parallel. So like we know there's like these lines.
Yeah. Latitude and longitudinal lines.
Latitude and longitude. That's what those lines are called. Yes, thank you. In 1794, another treaty, the Jay Treaty, further stated that the source of the St. Croix River would serve as a northern boundary between the U.S. and British Canada. But this didn't stop disputes from emerging in the next century. The first dispute is called, and this is, I'm not 100% sure I'm pronouncing this right, the Aroostook War, also known as the Pork and Beans War.
Sure.
All these wars had fun names.
That's
Pig
fun.
War, Pork and Beans War. This took place between 1837 and 1842. And this is basically a border dispute that emerged between Canada and Maine. And this came about because during the Jay Treaty, they said the border was going to be the source of the St. Croix River, but no one really knew what that was or where it was exactly. So that made things a bit ambiguous. And then in the War of 1812, the British were in the area. They occupied the area, which made things a bit more confusing because, like, some people had, like, property agreements with the British or the Americans. It was just confusion. In 1830, some residents of this area, which was now sort of in dispute, tried to incorporate their community into Maine, and militia from Canada showed up and arrested some of them to prevent this. At which point, the U.S. and Canada turned to the Netherlands for help, but the boundary decided upon by the King of the Netherlands was rejected by the U.S., although accepted by the British. So this didn't help that much. It was interesting. Yeah. The Pig War also was mediated by a European ruler, which is something we don't really do anymore, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, because I guess at the time, Canada was still British territory.
Well, there was no like international governing body back then. That would
so it was just like, hey, get another European.
Pick a king, and he'll look at this for you.
He can decide.
As this is going on, there's all these settlers and these lumberjacks from both the U.S. and Canada moving into the region, and they began to clash. They didn't actually like fight, but they clashed in these like bloodless conflicts. Like there was one called the Battle of the Caribou, in which loggers just basically threatened each other, and the U.S. and Canada both arrested loggers that had like gone into their territory.
It's nice that these border dispute wars, at least in this period, weren't actual wars.
Yeah, they kept it fairly chill.
Yeah.
In March 1839, British Canadian troops entered a disputed area, Aroostook, which was the name of the war. It had been claimed by the Americans, so Maine responded by calling up 10,000 volunteer militiamen. And the U.S. Congress also wanted to get involved. They allocated $10 million and 50,000 men. But the president, Martin Van Buren, sent a delegate, General Winfield Scott, to make peace, which he did.
Interesting.
He will come back. He does another thing later on in this episode. So remember his name.
Okay. Establishing his legacy.
Yeah. So in 1842, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty settled this boundary without shedding any blood. And the war became known as the Pork and Beans War because that's what soldiers and lumberjacks ate.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's such a dumb name for the war.
Pork and Beans War.
Yeah. It's like, because that's what they ate. It's like, well, yeah, but it doesn't really describe any of the events of what happened.
They weren't fighting over pork or beans.
Was it about pork and beans? No, it was about Canada and U.S. borders. It's like, oh, why? Okay.
Yeah. Is this region known for that? Not so much, but.
Not even like the Lumberjack War.
Right, which is kind of a better name because they were the ones on the front lines,
right?
So to speak. The next dispute came about just a couple years later, but on the other side of the country, and this was the the Oregon boundary dispute. I guess another thing, sort of like background, is like before the Revolutionary War, even after the Revolutionary War, like big swaths of North America were just divided by these European powers.
Right.
So as things shifted in Europe and power dynamics changed, so did these territories. But
right. Well, I mean, that was a big thing with like the Louisiana Purchase, was like getting that from French control
and the French needing to like sell that and get the money in. Yeah, in the early 19th century, both Russia and Spain gave up their right to the Pacific Northwest, and the British and the Americans were allowed to like occupy the region, which seems like obviously a short-term solution to just kind of be like, you can occupy it. But the U.S. interest in the region increased later on as more settlers were going west, and as the region changed from like traders to settlers, the U.S. began to be more interested in really like staking a claim to what they called Oregon country, and the British called the Columbia District, which kind of it's like the different names for movies sometimes between countries.
Right.
The Columbia District.
Yeah, the Columbia District is kind of funny because of what the District of Columbia.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating.
Well, then British Columbia is now in that area. But in any case, both the U.S. and Britain wanted to control this area, including Puget Sound, which is where I'm from.
Oh.
And this part is actually kind of interesting. In 1844, the Democratic candidate James K. Polk, a president that most people have forgotten existed, but he did, he called for the U.S. to annex the region. And this led to the popularization of the term manifest destiny, a term that is being thrown around now in our current political climate a little bit. This term is largely credited to a newspaper editor named John L. O'Sullivan. He was writing about the Oregon boundary dispute, and he said, quote, "And that claim is by the right of our manifest destiny to overspread and to possess the whole of the continent, which Providence has given us for the development of the great experiment of liberty and federated self-government entrusted to us." So it's basically this idea that's like we should control all of.
We've been sort of ordained, but they said providence, but you could say by God or by whatever.
Yeah, to control from coast to coast. We should spread west and take it. And this idea became really popular at the time.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, it is funny. I know that was sort of the thing at the time, like the British coming to America and being like, we're going to take this land now. And that continued, you could argue, till today with certain countries. But really up until probably about like around the time of the World Wars, where it was like grabbing territory from land that isn't your land. And it's like, it is funny to think, though, that after the American Revolution, when the 13 colonies were like, we want to be independent, it's like, okay, you guys can be, but the entire rest of the continent is still up for grabs.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's interesting now seeing how much, the United States is coast to coast. But imagine if, like, in the middle of all of that, like, Michigan was still British, which I guess is kind of like what Alaska is. It's like all of Canada, United States.
Right. Yeah.
It's just weird. It's just strange.
It is weird. Yeah. I mean, this was definitely a time of looking and wanting to expand the United States. The Mexican-American War was happening at the same time with, a similar argument of like, we should have this land.
Yeah.
Move west. It's, like you said, ordained. It's God wants us to, all these things. Sidebar, it's interesting, like this was like an American purpose to go west, like to settle the West. And when that ended, that became like this era of like, what does everything mean? Like,
where do we go now?
Existential crisis. But yeah, so he Manifest Destiny becomes a big thing. Polk initially suggests drawing the border at the 49th parallel, but more aggressive expansionists wanted him to go even further to the 54th, so much further north. And this led to the slogan 54-40 or fight, which is basically like, if the British don't yield Oregon country, the U.S. would go to war.
Wow.
Polk, like I mentioned, is dealing with the Mexican-American War at the time, not really interested in getting into another conflict. So he agrees to keep the border at the 49th parallel. And in 1846, the British agree to this in the Oregon Treaty. So this basically creates, like the modern Pacific Northwest and the border there between the U.S. and Canada. But like in the Pork and Beans War, they use kind of ambiguous language about where some things exactly were. So there's this strait kind of between Washington State and Canada called the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and there's all these islands in the strait. And in the treaty, they said that the border would run through a channel in the strait, but there's like multiple channels in the strait, and some of them are between the islands or on one side or the other side of the islands. It said it would, the exact language was run through the middle of the channel, which separates the continent from Vancouver Island, but there's just multiple channels.
Right.
So they both the British, represented by the Hudson Bay Company, and the Americans, coming from Washington Territory, lay claim to San Juan Island. And this is covered in the intro, but basically what happens is they're both there, and then a British pig is killed by an American farmer, and things like spiral out of control because it's like, whose land is this? They just needed to decide. And interestingly, one guy who is sent to deal with this is George Pickett, who historians might recognize from Pickett's Charge in the Civil War a little while later. But he was sent to the island with a proclamation stating that San Juan Island was United States territory. And the British sent a number of ships, including warships, and some 2,000 soldiers to, stare each other down. General Winfield Scott once again dispatched, this time by James Buchanan, to make peace. And once again, he did. The dispute was not resolved totally until 12 years later. But at that point, the San Juans became a U.S. territory, and they agreed the border would be, I guess, a bit further north.
Wow. Winfield Scott, the great peacemaker.
And I feel like he also did something in the Mexican-American War. I think maybe he ran for presidential nominee in the 1852 election. Yeah.
Wow.
He was known as Old Fuss and Feathers. Wow. Should bring back nicknames like that.
Yeah, we should.
Old Fuss and Feathers. So those are kind of basically the three disputes in the 19th century. I'll touch on one in the 20th century, which is this Alaska boundary dispute. As you said,
makes sense. That makes sense.
You mentioned Alaska before. The U.S. buys Alaska from Russia in 1867. At the time, it's called Seward's Folly after Secretary of State William Seward, because Americans were like, why do we need this land?
Yeah.
It's like in the middle of nowhere and it's barren, useless. But in any case, I guess this whole episode is sort of a lesson in like when you sign a treaty, you should make a strict boundary line that everyone agrees on, because once again, in this case, it harkens back to an earlier treaty between the Russians and the British, which set a southern coastal border along the 54th parallel but did not set a strict eastern boundary. So this becomes a problem starting in 1897 because the Klondike Gold Rush begins, and there's tens of thousands of people going to Yukon.
Yeah, vindication for Seward, though.
Yeah, really, yeah. Although I'm sure he was long dead by then.
Yeah.
He had a very exciting life. But at the time, Canada wants a direct route from the gold fields to the Pacific fjords, but the U.S. wanted to control this territory. And again, who controlled it was just made unclear in the Treaty of St. Petersburg. And the interesting thing, I guess, about this dispute is that it's mediated by a British official who sides with the Americans. And this really upsets the Canadians. And it plants these seeds for Canada to split from Britain entirely. I mean, this takes almost 100 years. Canada's not fully independent from Britain until the 1980s, which is much later than I knew.
Yeah, I was just, as we were like getting into this, I looked that up real quick because I was like, when did that happen? I was just curious. And it was like, the initial date that it brought up was like April 1981 or something. I was like, there's no way.
Yeah.
But then it was like, okay, they kind of became independent like 1867 or 1860 something.
Things were happening, like the movement was being made, but like this was one thing where this really helped the Canadian independence movement. The British shouldn't control our territory. We should have a more say in our own country. Yeah,
the official date of independence, just to put that out there since we brought it up, April 17th, 1982.
That's amazing. That's so recent.
43 years ago.
That's crazy.
That is actually wild.
Yeah, those are sort of kind of the big disputes of the last 200 years, but there are disputes to this day between the U.S. and Canada. The Northwest Passage, Canada claims that this is Canadian waters, while the U.S. says they're international waters, which is a bit interesting now because the Northwest Passage is south of Greenland, which the U.S. is sort of rattling about at this time. Right. There's also a dispute over maritime borders around what's called the Dixon Entrance between Alaska and British Columbia. There was, it's called an AB line established in an earlier treaty, but only Canada recognizes it, so that's still kind of a disputed area. There's a marginal sea called the Beaufort Sea north of Yukon in Alaska, and it's also a site of a border dispute, basically over a section of the international boundary. And then, of course, anyone following politics knows there's been some discussion.
Some bold claims over annexing Canada, making it the entire country the 51st state.
Correct.
Which is a wild proposition for many reasons. Chiefly that, why are we talking about it? Secondly, you simply have to make it multiple states if that were to even happen, which I don't think it should.
That'd be pretty big.
To any Canadian listeners out there, we're not fans of this plan.
Yeah, I think this episode was a listener-suggested episode, and I think it's interesting to think about he's saying this right now, and it feels unusual and like alien, and it is those things, but also like there's been such a long history of these like border disputes. Right. Obviously, what he's saying is like kind of more than a border dispute. It's like an invasion or an annexation, but there's a history of like discussions or almost wars about certain parts of the border there. So
and I think Trump's comments especially feel very out of place in the modern world because this sort of idea of expansionism is not really prominent anymore, other than like Russia really wanting Ukraine. Not a lot of other countries that are constantly like looking to expand their territory much anymore.
Right.
Like their physical territory. I think because like we're more globalized and like you can exert influence in so many other ways. It's like, do we really need more land? Do we need more space?
Right.
For what?
Well, and there's like, people's countries, like they have a right to like their country, and the UN is like around to be like, don't invade other countries. And that's
international law is a lot. Well, it exists. It exists now.
It exists.
It didn't back then. It does now.
thank you to the listener for sending the suggestion. It was educational to learn about these different disputes. And
yeah, no, it is very interesting. I love the pig war thing.
The pig war is
all
pretty
it took
funny.
was one pig.
I know.
The pig is comparable to like Helen of Troy.
Poor pig. He just wanted some potatoes, and
he was a martyr. That pig was a martyr.
Although he was a British pig, and he lost the island for the British in the end. The Americans got it.
Tragic. I mean, I guess not for us. Good for us, but
yeah, San Juan's beautiful. I guess if you are a member, you will be getting an extra part of today's episode, just History Happy Hour, which we actually just recorded with our colleague Amber. You can become a member if you want perks like that by going to allthat'sinteresting.com/membership. I think you also get dark mode and something else. No ads.
No ads on the website.
No ads.
For $5 a month. Not
a bad deal.
Not subjected to tariffs either. We're an American company.
Right. If you're not quite at membership level yet, that's fine. But you can also get our newsletter by going to allthat'sinteresting.com/sign-up. Or if you want to keep it chill, just check us out online, allthat'sinteresting.com. We do publish things, lots of things, every day. Lots of things.
News, more like long form stuff covering interesting, sometimes pretty niche historical topics. Stuff that you don't like typically hear about. So that's pretty cool. We are also on MSN. I think it's MSN News. I don't want to do the ATM machine thing. If the N already stands for news, I do think it is MSN News though.
Yeah, we have been going on there lately as well. If you see us there,
if you prefer
say
that
hello.
Way, yeah. Also, you can find us on social media as well on Instagram at History Uncovered Podcast, on TikTok, which is somehow still here.
They just got an extension, 75 more days.
Wasn't expecting it.
And Amazon might buy them, apparently.
Interesting. Don't know how I feel about that. Don't know how I feel about that.
If that would make them less popular. If that
probably
people would feel like, ew, it's like this big corporation or what.
Probably. But we're still there. So Real History Uncovered over there, also on YouTube. And like we said, this was a listener write-in. The past couple episodes have been as well. So it was the next one at the very least. So if you also want to write in, you can email us at allthat'sinteresting or podcast@allthat'sinteresting.com. I'm losing my mind. I'm so tired.
It's Friday feeling.
Friday feeling.
You can also call in if you'd prefer to do that, 929-526-3029. And we have been getting a lot of listener suggestions, which is always exciting. Like, we're always excited to get emails or calls, I think, from listeners. But the episode suggestions have been especially fun, and we've been doing a lot of them lately. So if you have an idea for an episode, we'd love to hear it.
Yeah, it's nice to know that inherently what we're covering that week or that episode is going to be interesting to at least one person.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And it's, it's always interesting to learn about new things that we might not cover otherwise. So.
Yeah. And, we've talked about it a lot, but a lot of these old things are very relevant today still in a lot of cases, as seen with this episode. So,
yeah, for sure. And we'll be back in a few weeks with Selena's murder.
Yes.
So that'll be a kind of a pivot from this.
Yeah.
Definitely a different kind of episode, but I'm excited for that one as well.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to dive into.
For sure.
A nice little break from the more politically charged. Well, who knows? Maybe somehow it all ties back to who knows.
Maybe so. We'll dig into it next time. But in the meantime, check us out online. Send us an email with your ideas and
take it easy.
Take it easy.
Treat yourselves good.